Good afternoon. Welcome to KAI. My name is Yang Kwan, and I'm the Director of Communications. On May 21st, President Biden concluded a summit with South Korean President Jae-in. This is perhaps meaningful because it is only the second in-person meeting that President Biden has held with a world leader since he was elected. Meanwhile, this is likely going to be one of the last that President Moon holds as his 5-year term approaches an end in 2022. Our KAI team here is gathered here today to provide an assessment of the outcomes from this engagement. In conjunction with the summit, KAI also conducted a survey with YouGov on American public attitudes towards the Korean Peninsula. Members of the staff participating in this conversation took part in the design of this survey and will help us contextualize the summit through this framework. If you would like to see the survey outcomes, you can find them on the slider of our homepage at keia.org. We will also be taking questions later in the webinar. So if you're watching us live, either on Zoom or YouTube, please do submit questions in our chat or the Q&A function. I won't go too deeply into the profiles of all the members of the team here with us today, but I will just introduce them briefly. We have with us Mark Tokola, Vice President at KAI, Troy Stangarone, Senior Director and Fellow, Kyle Ferrier, Director of Academic Affairs and Fellow, and Junie Kim, Senior Manager for Operations and Technology. The team here brings decades of collective experience in foreign service, the U.S. Congress, the private sector, and as you might have suspected, Korea watching. So I think they will bring a lot to the table in discussing the outcomes from the recent summit. So with no further delay, if I might ask the team to provide maybe a very quick remark on what they saw as the most notable outcome from the summit. And maybe I can start with you, Mark. Maybe you could also add what you thought was the personal relations that you noticed between President Moon and Biden.
Okay, thanks, Young. I think the biggest impression I got from the summit was how well prepared it was. If you look at the fact sheet and the joint statement, it's pages of details about areas of future cooperation. So obviously a lot of staff work went into it. It's almost as if over the last 4 years, issues have been piling up, and now they've all been compiled into this summit. Any summit tries to do two things. One is to convey a clear impression of the two countries about how they want the relationship to be seen. The other is to lay the foundation for future cooperation. I think the summit succeeded in doing both. In terms of personal chemistry, President Biden noted in his joint press conference that meetings ran over. And so it's always a good sign, I think, when two summiteers take longer than they're supposed to. It means they have a lot to talk about.
Troy, if you might continue the views.
Yeah, so for me, I think what really stood out was the substance of this summit. If you look back at, for example, the initial joint vision statement between Presidents Lee Pak and Barack Obama, if you look back at President Moon's first summit with President Donald Trump, there is a distinctive difference between this one and those. In the first case, we talked about things like working together on green growth, cyber, and a few other issues, but they were kind of just stuck in there. There wasn't really any detail on how we're going to go about doing this. And I can tell you after the summit that there were conversations about how we actually go about, trying to implement these types of cooperation. There was more deeper discussion in the President Trump's and President Moon's first summit meeting. But I think, this one here, you can see that, yes, some of the issues have changed because of, for example, the pandemic, as opposed to when President Obama was coming to office. Of course, FTA was the primary issue on the docket. But there's a lot of depth and specificity, and I can now look at this and I can get a feel for how we're going to go about doing this. So I think that, to me, is the biggest thing, is that we're not just having aspirations anymore. We actually have worked through and talked about how we're going to try and implement and cooperate on not just the COVID-19 pandemic, but things like climate change and other issues.
Thank you, Troy. Kyle, would you like to add?
Yeah, thanks, Jung, and thanks for agreeing to moderate and for bringing us all here together for this conversation. My sort of big takeaway is kind of a combination of things that Mark and Troy have already alluded to, both in terms of personalities and substance. And that really has to do with the amount of investment that South Korea was bringing to the table in this meeting, in the summit, and what sort of that went to. The number that they have right now, I've seen it fluctuating, but somewhere around 25 billion. And a lot of this money, a lot of the new investments from Korean companies are going into new areas like semiconductors, electric batteries, things that are really important to the Biden administration. And I think it's interesting. Biden has certainly come very prepared for this summit, just like he did the first summit with President Trump when he came to town, and bringing a delegation of Korean business leaders with him, who pledged about $12 billion for investment in the United States through 2021, but more importantly, about $25 billion in new purchases of U.S. oil and gas and planes, things along those lines, to help decrease the bilateral trade deficit. And he played very well to Biden this time around by focusing on new fourth industrial revolution technologies, new semiconductors, EVs, things that are really important to the Biden administration. And I think those will really be helpful moving forward to sort of frame the relationship, whereas Biden was very much more focused. Trump was very much more focused on short-term bilateral issues. It seems as if the investment and the tenor of the investment and the quality of the investment in the United States reflects a bit more longer-term, tech forward-looking issues, which we sort of see reflected in the overall joint statement and fact sheet as well.
Yeah, thank you, Kyle. I mean, we're going to go more in depth into the commercial ties and the commercial outcomes and the tech outcomes. But I also wanted to bring in Junie Kim. You're in a very unique position because you not only got to see the outcomes from the summit, but see them through the lens of the recent survey. Would you be able to say a little bit about how you saw things from your perspective?
Sure, happy to, Young. Yeah, and just to give a little bit of context of our survey. So, like Young had mentioned, this is something that we had worked with YouGov on, and I put into the field prior to the survey. We asked Americans about on various issues related to the U.S.-South Korea alliance. And one particular note that I wanted to share with everybody is we asked a number of respondents about issues that the U.S. and South Korea should cooperate on. And of the issues listed here, we have North Korea, development of international trade rules, global human rights, technology infrastructure. Basically, all these were touched upon in one way or another within the summit itself. And as you can see here, the top issue that was most important for most Americans of issues that should be cooperated on is North Korea. And the other ones kind of have a varying range of 46 to 38%. On top of that as well, there's actually a pretty big political divide as well. So for Democratic respondents to the survey, they were more likely to want to see cooperation on critical issues such as global health, climate change, global human rights. So in retrospect, it did not to give ourselves too much of a pat on the back, but in some ways, this list of topics is kind of a rundown of the major outcomes that we saw out of the survey, out of the summit that we had on Friday.
Thank you, Junie. That was incredibly succinct, and I hope to hear more about it later in this discussion. Troy mentioned that there were a lot of succinct and specific outcomes from the summit, and I hope maybe we can start by digging into some of those areas. Of note, one of the key objectives that the South Korean government came to the summit with was to get assistance on COVID-19 vaccination in South Korea. And the United States government did promise to help with vaccinating South Korean servicemen. Did this outcome reflect sufficient progress on vaccination? How do you think the outcomes reflected the relationship in the alliance?
So, Young, I think when we look at the vaccination side, there were a couple structural things to consider. One, you have India in a very difficult situation with COVID-19. You have other developing countries who are struggling to try and get vaccines. So I think some of the expectations may have been risen for the summit, specifically because the United States had agreed to provide through loans some vaccines to Canada and Mexico. But in the case of Mexico, for example, I mean, they're going through a much more difficult situation than South Korea's. So I think politically, on the international level, it would have been difficult to supply South Korea a large number of vaccines without addressing these broader issues. And if we look at sort of what was discussed in the summit and concluded, they agreed to take and work towards increasing production capacity and specifically working with South Korean companies to do that. And so When you look at the United States, what they've done so far, out of the vaccines that they are going to donate internationally, which is now up to about 20 million, what we're going to do is take and provide those through COVAX. And so when you look at the U.S. South Korea summit, it also states that we'll work through COVAX through this process. And so I think, this was important because one, ultimately dealing with the pandemic means getting everyone in all countries vaccinated. And so that means going through an organization like COVAX that's working globally, that's working in these developing countries to get the vaccines out. And I think, from the Korean perspective, the one question, which at least to me is still sort of unclear, is, out of these vaccines that will be produced in South Korea, will there be a percentage that will be able to be used or temporarily loaned for a period of time to vaccinate the South Korean population? So I think on the whole, expectations may have been a little high, but I think ultimately this is actually a very good outcome for not just the United States and South Korea, but the broader global community on COVID-19.
Yeah, I'd just like to add briefly, I think there was a lot of expectations coming into this on whether it would be like a chip for a vaccine swap or something along those lines, where South Korea had thought they were going to get a lot more tangibly in this area. But I think I agree with Troy. South Korea did take a lot away from this, and it's ever closer to being the new towards its new priority of being a global hub or a regional hub of vaccine production. And it's not clear where all of those vaccines will be going to that are going to be at least partially assembled in Korea. But I think that it could help to speed up the transition of the South Korean public receiving more vaccines, and even the vaccines to South Korean troops. It's not that much of a change because a lot of the troops already have been vaccinated in South Korea, at least those over 30. And so delivering those vaccines to people who are under 30 could help speed things up with the vaccination process there, and even allow some extra doses, really not all that much, but at least some extra doses to maybe be freely made available to the larger public. So I think there is some silver lining here, even though Koreans might have been thinking they were going to get more out of this. But I agree with Troy. I think it's overall a good thing for them, for both our countries.
I might add that I was struck in the press conference. President Biden mentioned a couple of times that the reason, or one of the reasons to give troops in the ROK military the vaccination is because they work with U.S. troops. So it's almost as if he was saying the reason to do this is to protect U.S. troops in South Korea. It was like he was anticipating criticism either domestically that we should not be exporting vaccines, or criticism of other countries that why we're giving it to South Korea, not to them. So putting it in terms of troop protection gave a reason to do it.
There is one other dimension that I think isn't in the statement that I think will come up in time, which is, as I mentioned, to stop the pandemic, we have to get people vaccinated in all the countries of the world, and that includes North Korea. And so one question I think, that's going to be important is, one, will any of these vaccines, either through COVAX or indirectly, be offered to North Korea? And after those are offered, will North Korea be willing to accept vaccines from the United States produced in South Korea? So there is a potentially down the road, as this situation develops, a North Korea angle as well that we should keep in mind.
Yeah, I think North Korea has been offered vaccination, just hasn't accepted them.
They have been allotted some through COVAX, and they are willing to take the COVAX vaccines. But because of production delays and because India has actually cut off its exports temporarily to deal with its situation, COVAX has been having to delay those. So I think they were supposed to originally receive them in May, and now it's pushed back to July, if I remember correctly. But so there is some going, but it's not going to be enough to vaccinate North Korea, either this year or next year.
Well, I'm glad North Korea came up, and I'm sure we'll get to more discussions on the North Korean denuclearization question later on as well. But since the topic came up, I encourage everyone watching live to also tune in on Thursday for a discussion between Troy Stangarone and Dr. Kee Park at Harvard Medical School regarding the efforts and limitations of our international efforts to vaccinate North Korea. And I think it'll be a very meaningful conversation that ties in very well with the conversation that we're having today. I wanted to follow up on something that Kyle mentioned early on about long-term views and some of the technology agreement that came out of the U.S. Korea summit. On the U.S. side, one of the things that we were hoping to get help from the South Korean side was to leverage South Korea's technology industry to fill some of the gaps that the U.S. has had in semiconductor chips following the recent shortfalls that we had that's affecting the automotive industry and other electronic sectors. Kyle, do you think we gained ground on this area?
Yeah, I think so. The proverbial question is it enough? And there's definitely way more space for the United States to ramp up its semiconductor production design in the US. But I think what this moment also highlighted is that there's probably never been a time in history where Korea has been seen as so central to the global economy. Semiconductors right now, because of the semiconductors in South Korea was always seen as being crucially important for South Korea. I know Troy has written about this a lot in recent years, but I think with the shortage brought on by the pandemic and the complications that it sort of happened in the auto industry and sort of spread elsewhere, have really highlighted how important these chips are and really how poised Korean companies are to take advantage of all of this. And I think it's great that the Biden administration identified Samsung and Korea early on in meetings even before the summit as South Korea as a partner to help meet U.S. shortfall on semiconductor production. And certainly Samsung's new pledged investment of $17 billion to help build a new facility somewhere in the United States is welcome news and will help sort of shore up U.S. supply chains. But a lot of the questions surrounding the supply chains aren't just about the bilateral issue, but also has to do with China. And we're still waiting to hear from the supply chain review from the Biden administration. And that really this wasn't something that came up directly in the joint statement and the fact sheet. I think that both sides were very keen to avoid calling out China either way. But there was a lot of discussion about the resiliency of supply chains, but it wasn't in terms of decoupling from China. It was talking about building up global supply and strengthening our shared resiliency on the supply chains. So I think that there's effort here from South Korea to ensure that that their supply chains are still connected in a global way. It's not really clear what the Biden administration's review will tell us sooner than later. But I think this is something that a more complicated issue that wasn't necessarily addressed here because the Biden administration policy review hasn't been completed yet. And so the question of linking supply chains through China, decoupling them with China hasn't been addressed here. And I think that might provide some additional complications later down the line.
You know, when we think though, Yang, about this issue of supply chain security, which has been, a key issue for the Biden administration, specifically in the area of semiconductors, there's a couple of things I think to keep in mind. One, when we look at the investments, Kyle mentioned the Samsung investment, and we often look at what's being invested in the United States, but DuPont also announced they would be investing in South Korea to build an R&D facility specifically for semiconductor chemicals. And so, I think what we're starting to see here is that the United States and South Korea are starting to tie their semiconductor industries closer together. But also some of this, clearly is still the overhang of the situation between South Korea and Japan, to where Japan cut off certain key chemicals, one of which now DuPont has also built or in the process of building a factory in South Korea to supply. And so I think that there's sort of an acknowledgement that the two countries need to work together to make sure that they have not just the production facilities, but also the supply side of the components, because it's fine to have a semiconductor factory here in the United States or in South Korea, but if you can't gain access to the chemicals and the parts you need to take and produce those chips, it doesn't matter if the factory is here. And the last thing, Kyle mentioned the review on supply chains. I would hope that because there's been some discussion that Samsung might not actually simply expand the Austin facility, but that they might build a facility somewhere else. I think if we're really concerned about resiliency, given what we've seen with the storm that hit Texas, where the Samsung Austin facility was down for about 5 weeks, it would make sense to, even if you expand the Austin facility somewhat, to put a second Samsung plant in another part of the country. And if we're going to tie this into policy, perhaps somewhere to where there is nuclear power or hydropower, because at the end of the day, semiconductors are an energy intensive industry. And so if we want to deal with climate change, we want supply chain security, we should probably be factoring these things into our decisions on investments as well.
Thank you, Troy and Kyle. Those are incredibly informative comments. One of the reasons why chips are important is because they're critical components to frontier technologies, right? The technologies that will help us reduce global carbon emissions through the construction of automated vehicles and other non-carbon intensive vehicles and tools. Indeed, climate change is an area that has received particular attention under the Biden administration from very early days in President Biden's terms. Were there any significant outcomes on climate change in the discussions between President Moon and Biden?
So I think there were. Some of these were sort of telegraphed specifically from the Leaders Summit on Climate earlier, but South Korea has recommitted to taking and providing a new nationally defined contribution to reducing emissions, which will come out in October in an initial form and then be finalized at the COP26 summit in Glasgow in November. Both countries have agreed to take, and not just simply because South Korea announced beforehand that they would eliminate financing of coal power plants abroad, but that they will work through the OECD and other international fora to eliminate the financing of international overseas coal plants. They've also agreed to align their policies to ensure that international investment is green and that we're not trying to take and work counter to our climate change objectives. And there's also, and I think this is going to be key, if you go through the fact sheet, there is discussion specifically on joint investments into research and development, one of which is on hydrogen storage. South Korea has been investing a lot of money in trying to take and move hydrogen into a new fuel source that we can use in vehicles, that we can use to power electric cities and convert power plants to. Storage is going to be a key component of that. So I think this is important. There's also electric vehicle batteries research. So there's a lot of cooperation on the technologies and in trying to work together internationally to ensure our investments are green and that we are reducing our emissions.
Thank you, Troy. Turning our attention to something that rightly or wrongly gets heightened attention whenever discussions on U.S. Korea relations gets raised is, of course, the big bad wolf in the region, North Korea. President Biden was conciliatory in his statements about potential engagement with North Korea, but he also added that he will not give Kim Jong-un the recognition that he seeks. I think it was a very pointed remarks towards President Biden's predecessor and the way the previous administration approached engagement with North Korea. Meanwhile, we're aware that South Korea's Jae-in had been advocating for a peace treaty to conclude the Korean War, and that's been one of his key aims in his 5-year term. Did the recent engagements between President Moon and Biden reveal anything new about where the United States and South Korean government's views were aligned or misaligned?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at that. I think that what the summit showed is that we're now more aligned than we were a couple of months ago. I think President Biden said that he was not willing to meet with Kim Jong-un yet, but I think he said that under the right conditions he would. And the conditions were a lot of staff preparation, traditional building up to the summit rather than a sudden summit, and that if the staffs of in Pyongyang and Washington, D.C. and Seoul worked together and found grounds for a summit, he'd be prepared to do it. We've not seen the outcome of the administration's North Korea policy review, but they've talked about it a lot. So I think we have a general idea what it's about. And the words are calibrated, practical, gradual, flexible. They're all words that indicate that the Biden administration is prepared to take a different approach towards North Korea, which is to find ways to cooperate with them where it makes sense, where it can be done practically. To me, the word that struck me most in the entire summit was when, in the press conference, when President Biden said that we were going to reduce tensions together with Seoul as we move towards our ultimate goal of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. People can correct me if I'm wrong, but I've never heard the word ultimate goal used in terms of denuclearization. That means not a precondition or a condition. It means at the end of the road. That leaves a room for a lot of diplomacy between now and then. I think that's a striking statement.
Far be it for me, Mark, to try and correct you, because I don't know the answer for this either. But I think that sort of fits in with the shift from the Biden administration, or from the Trump administration to the Biden administration on these issues. You're talking about being flexible. The Trump administration was very much all for a big deal up front, where it seems as if the ultimate goal that you referenced is sort of aligned with the more phased approach that the Biden administration seems to be pursuing. That, of course, we don't really know what the exact policy is, but as you mentioned previously when we were talking about this, that does lend some advanced credibility to the policy itself, because if you can't necessarily see it, it's harder to criticize. So it is this general sense of guidelines as opposed to specific tenets that are going to drive our policy moving forward.
Yeah, the question before was never whether Trump and Kim trust each other. I mean, the question was whether Trump and Kim trust their own staffs to negotiate. And what Biden is signaling is he has a staff he's trusting to negotiate North Korea by naming Special Envoy Sung Kim. I think he's showing that very clearly. The question now is whether Kim Jong-un will trust anybody under him to actually negotiate.
Well, I think he has to. And I think, part of what this, to go back to your use of the phrase or the word ultimate, is that it's acknowledging a reality. I remember when Trump was about to meet with Kim Jong-un, Sig Hecker had put out an estimate that it would take 15 years most likely to dismantle the program. So even if tomorrow we get, on paper that they'll dismantle everything, this is still going to be the ultimate destination because it's not something that's happening tomorrow. But, on the negotiation side, I think it's actually really important that we have these discussions. I know that there's this question about whether anyone other than Kim Jong-un can make a decision. But the reality is, at the end of the day, neither President Trump and Kim Jong-un or President Biden and Kim Jong-un are ultimately going to be experts on these weapons and what needs to really be in any agreement. I think they can make final decisions on big picture issues. And to be honest, I'm sure that Kim Jong-un knows more details about the nuclear program than any U.S. president ever has. So that's not necessarily a comment on him or any of them. But I think these are the kinds of things where you need specialized people who know what needs to be in an agreement to sort of make that in advance. And then it's up to the leaders to decide the big picture questions of whether they really will trade off one thing for another. And so I think, that's sort of where someone like Sung Kim is important, because, he brings not only a lot of experience on the issue, but a lot of experience working in South Korea as our former ambassador there. So, I mean, he's well versed in what a lot of the different sides are going to be looking for. And then he's going to be able to draw off a lot of people in the U.S. government who can help him on the technical details that, with all due respect to, Sung Kim, even he's not going to know because, this isn't necessarily his specialty either.
Yeah, but I'll hammer home the point just one more time. I think this is actually a big change. If you remember, it wasn't very long ago, U.S. government was saying under previous administrations, not just Trump, that if North Korea denuclearized, then many things would become possible. Relations, liaison offices, economic assistance. That's not the line now. The line now is we will get to denuclearization at the end. It's crucial, but a lot of things can happen in between to reduce tensions. That's very different.
Mark, to your comments about the ultimate destination and talks of a gradual or phased approach, we actually had we actually surveyed as part of the YouGov survey here questions to Americans about whether they would support a preliminary deal with North Korea that would partially dismantle its nuclear weapons capabilities instead of a total deal that you would assume. Just to set the expectations that that's not going to be complete denuclearization right off the bat. And as part of that, most Americans would support that. That you see here, just in the nationally representative sample that we had, 54% support a preliminary deal that would partially dismantle the nuclear weapons capabilities. And there's not that many that oppose it. The second most we have is actually people that aren't sure about it. So there's actually a lot more people that are positive than there are negative. And that's true for both Democrats and Republicans, so that it's not a very partisan issue, that most Americans are comfortable with the idea of an initial deal, of something that we're getting the ball rolling, as opposed to something very big and immediate.
And, I think this is an important finding because there have been a lot of things in the United States that become sort of partisan issues. And this shows that, to an extent, North Korea isn't a partisan issue yet. Now, I'm fully cognizant that once we actually have some type of deal on paper or some kind of idea of a deal, that a lot of that will go away. But I do think this finding is important because it suggests that the American public is realistic. They've seen this issue go on for a long time. They know it's not going to be solved tomorrow. And so if we can get something that will move us in the right direction, that seems to be something they'll support. I think the real question for the Moon and the Biden administrations going forward is, while the American public may be supportive of this, will the political class be supportive? Meaning, will you see Republican senators come out against a deal simply because it's a partial deal that doesn't have the details that they want, or because the Biden administration negotiated it? And so, I'd like to think that they'll be more reflective and that they have over time realized the challenges of dealing with North Korea. But, I think that's going to be the issue going forward. Not that the public's going to be an issue here, but that it will be, members of Congress who potentially will be a challenge.
If I may ask a question regarding a subset of the outcomes from the discussions on North Korea, there was a surprise announcement about the appointment of Special Envoy Sung Kim. He's, of course, a veteran member of the U.S. State Department, and he's been involved in negotiations with North Korea in the past under the previous administrations. What does his appointment say about Washington's outlook? Can we learn anything from this announcement?
Well, I think it shows that Biden is relying on a deeply experienced bench. He seems to be doing that in many policy areas. Sung Kim was not only a previous special envoy for North Korea, he was special envoy for the six-party talks. I'm not sure if any U.S. diplomat has as much background as he does in dealing with North Koreans. So his appointment, I think, shows that they're prepared to go back and look at the history of negotiations, and they're prepared to rely on a lot of experience. And it's going to be a team project. It's not going to be Sung Kim on his own. It's going to be Sung Kim working with a team, the State Department and National Security Council and other agencies. The Biden team seems to work in groups rather than individuals. That's healthy.
Yeah, I think the question is often raised, how important is North Korea for the United States? Is it a priority for the administration or is it not? And I think this shows that it is. I mean, I know Kurt Campbell has said this publicly multiple times that North Korea will be a priority. And there are some things, obviously, like the pandemic, which will be a higher priority. But you don't appoint someone like Sung Kim, someone with his experience, his background, to this kind of position if this isn't an issue that you do want to try to make progress on. And so I think, from the administration's perspective, this is a clear signal that they have a serious plan and they have serious intentions of working on this. I think the real question ultimately comes down to, what does North Korea want? Because much of the discussion in the lead up to the summit, and even soon after President Biden was elected, was, the Biden administration has to do something quickly on North Korea. But that seems to take away all the agency from North Korea and forget that North Korea has to be willing to do something as well. And the question right now, I think, for a lot of us is, is North Korea interested in negotiating?
Just a quick comment on the importance of the North Korean issue for the Biden administration. We had asked a question in the survey about whether Americans think that this is also an important issue. Of dealing with denuclearization is still something that they see as something as very important, not that important. And let me go ahead and share this here. As you can see in the results here, again, both bipartisan support. There's large support of most Americans that do see it as not only an important issue, but very important. I think notably so among Republicans, where you see 54% of Republican respondents saw the agreement to dismantle North Korean nuclear weapons as a very important issue. So on the American public side, that this is still something that's very top of mind, is something that they see as something critical to the U.S.
Oh, and Judy, I don't know if you have it available, but we also surveyed and asked the American public what are some of their the top concerns in terms of what are the greatest challenges for the United States. And North Korea was in the top 3, if I remember correctly, right, Judy?
Yes, I'm just about to share that now. Yeah, so just to go off what Troy had mentioned, We had asked Americans on a number of foreign policy issues affecting the U.S. and what Americans saw as the most critical foreign policy challenge. We had them rank among the available 5 options that we have listed here. And you see that North Korean nuclear capabilities is number 2 in terms of ones that were ranked in the top 3 choice among the 5 options that we had just after the COVID-19 crisis. So a lot of Americans not choose North Korean nuclear capabilities as the number 1 issue, but a large percentage of them did see it as an important issue.
If I might follow up on some of the other results from the survey, Junie, you had shared earlier that the American public largely agrees and would be okay with a partial deal with North Korea as an intermediary step forward in going towards the ultimate goal of denuclearization. Another interesting result that I noticed was the broad US public support for accepting South Korea's lead in negotiations with North Korea. What does that mean, and how was that reflected perhaps in the summit negotiations between President Moon and President Biden?
Yeah, sure. So I'll go ahead and share those results as well. Yeah, like you just mentioned, we also asked in the survey what Americans thought of supporting following South Korea's lead in denuclearization talks with North Korea. And as you can see here, there was also very large support, both also bipartisan support for following South Korea's lead on denuclearization talks, which is to say that in the summit, we saw some comments about that. I believe in the joint statement, it said that the Biden administration approves of the Moon administration's efforts in inter-Korean, any inter-Korean talks and diplomatic efforts to move along the peace process. And we saw that term lockstep, that the US and South Korea would be lockstep in their North Korean policy. So what this says to me, what the survey result says is that the American public is still very largely accepting of this type of idea, that it's not something that they demand that the US take the lead on.
And I think, we also saw this in the summit declaration because there had been a lot of expectation, obviously, that the Biden administration, as part of their policy review, would announce that they were going to adopt the Singapore statement and that would become part of our US policy. But they also, in the joint statement, mentioned that they're also taking on inter-Korean agreements as well. And so I think this sort of shows that even in the administration, this really is sort of a partnership. We're willing to work with and obviously take on South Korean ideas on how to address this issue. And I think that's what's sort of important about the survey results. It shows that the American public agrees that we should be taking on South Korean ideas and trying to resolve this issue. There are always going to be challenges in terms of the literal sense of South Korea taking the lead because, North Korea in the past has shown that they only really want to negotiate bilaterally with the United States. But at a practical sense, I think we can, as Junie mentioned, work lockstep with each other, have common ideas, and bring in the South Korean perspective as well into these talks.
Yeah, the Moon administration is quite keen that the summit agree to build on the Singapore Declaration, and it did that and went beyond that. It said Singapore and Panmunjom and all previous inter-Korean agreements and US DPRK agreements. So that was done.
Okay, thank you everybody for that excellent summary of the very complex issue around North Korea. I feel like every time North Korea issue comes up, it's always very technical and always very, very complex. So that was a very good summation of all the outcomes. Turning slightly to the other big elephant in the room, China. Now, the People's Republic of China wasn't explicitly mentioned, but of course, the US-China rivalry is the zeitgeist that haunts pretty much all engagements in the Indo-Pacific. Were there indications on how the two countries were managing this headwind together in the region? And perhaps more pointedly, do you find it notable that the Quad wasn't really mentioned in the talks between the two leaders?
If I could just jump in first on this. Yeah, I think the broad scope of the joint statement and the joint fact sheet was very much focused on a lot of regional issue areas for cooperation, and specifically areas where the United States and South Korea can coordinate their regional foreign policies. South Korea, its New Southern policy, and the U.S. Indo-Pacific policy towards the region. And so there's tons of different areas that were highlighted previously, but I think this is something that Troy had mentioned. There's a lot more detail in how the U.S. and South Korea were going to move forward in areas like digital trade, development in the Mekong subregion, global health, all these different aspects of regional cooperation. And I think if we get too focused on the Quad, we sort of lose sight of the bigger picture. And I think this is something that came up in an event we had last Tuesday as part of a two-part event on Korea and the Indo-Pacific. And one of the speakers said, it's important to remember that the Quad shouldn't be identified as being the Indo-Pacific. The Quad is a forum, a venue, one of the many layers of cooperation, one of the many outlets of cooperation in the region. And it shouldn't be seen as the be all end all of cooperation. And I really think that the level of detail and the broad areas in which the U.S. has shown an appreciation for, much more so, I think, than the previous administration, who was much more focused on traditional security areas. I think that this summit and the statement really shows a sincere interest in these areas where there wasn't really that same interest before. And it could really help to shore up U.S. Korea cooperation, or at least the perception that there is a lack of cooperation on really important areas in between South Korea and the United States. Both countries can still work together, even though they have to sort of advance each other's interests, even though they don't necessarily have the same threat perceptions of China. Well, maybe not the same threat perceptions, because I think a lot of Koreans see China as a threat, but they have different structural constraints upon them that allow them to take different paths moving forward. And I think the United States is showing a much more open, is taking a much more open approach to what South Korea brings to the table than the previous administration did, which is all around a good thing.
Yeah, if you look at the summit as a whole, I was struck the summit wasn't anti-anything, except maybe COVID-19. It wasn't that there's a common threat that's forcing South Korea and the US to cooperate. It's that they share values and see opportunities. So it was a very positive looking agenda rather than being being a required alliance deal with a common threat. It was about future opportunities. And you don't have to use the word China to show that the summit results are the US and South Korea share common values and have common objectives. So that brings the countries together without the common threat.
And to sort of build off what Mark and Kyle have said, I think we oftentimes overstate the Quad. If we look at vaccines, the United States and South Korea agreed to work through the COVAX, infrastructure. COVAX is in a much better place to sort of deliver vaccines because, this is underpinned by Gavi, which does global vaccinations, around the world. And also, when you think about it this way, what they're really looking at here is, how do we cooperate on the issues that matter and what is the best for that? I'm not sure on some of these issues that the Quad is. If we go to semiconductors, for example, Yang, you've pointed this out to me a lot of times, the Netherlands is an important player in this issue, not a member of the Quad. I think we need to be more flexible in our thinking about, not, are we saying sort of the key words everyone wants to say, be they China or be they the Quad, but are we getting the types of cooperation and the type of results we need to address the challenges that we face or the opportunities that are presented to us? And so I think as we work together on semiconductors, as we work together on electric vehicles, as we work together on electric vehicle batteries, as we work together on climate change, if there are things that the Quad is working on that parallel some of these, that's all fine. But I also think it's important that the United States and South Korea work together on these broader global initiatives to have real impact around the world. Because at the end of the day, we can't address climate change and we can't address economic growth and the challenges we face right now if we don't address COVID-19 in every country in the world. And the only way we're going to do that is through COVAX at the end of the day. And so, the Quad may have a role to play, but I think ultimately, it goes back to what Shakespeare would have said: a rose by any other name is just as sweet.
Very nicely said. I think that's a very good summary of broadly the big outcomes from the summit. I was hoping in the last 15 minutes, we might actually be able to turn to some of the questions from the audience. And I'll start with one from Mr. Terrence Matsuo. He asks, with 1 year left in his term, does President Moon Jae-in have any incentives to concentrate on repairing Korea-Japan relations? If so, what kind of actions do you think he will take? If not, what kind of stance should Japan take?
Well, maybe I'll take an initial stab at this. I do think there is an incentive. We cannot, obviously ignore the fact that there have been growing tensions between South Korea and Japan over, historical issues related to the comfort of women, related to, the issue of forced labor. Those need to be worked through, but there are also broader areas to where cooperation makes sense. And part of that means repairing relations. And, President Moon has hinted at this, that, he's willing to try to work with Japan, where they can, to try and, build ties in other areas. One thing that makes sense, Japan is also pursuing hydrogen vehicles. Australia, for example, is potentially a vast source of green hydrogen. The Japanese government, or companies, I can't remember if it's on the corporate government side, but are talking with Australia about trying to provide and ship that to Japan. I think given where the technologies are and everything, if the three countries were working together, perhaps with the United States, this could be another quad, if you will, of cooperation. We could maybe start moving forward on some of these other green technologies. So you have, a need, a potential for cooperation on some of these economic and environmental issues where interests overlap. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we always talk about, but there is a security interest that overlaps between the two countries when it comes to North Korea. U.S. reserve troops are, based in Japan. If there's another conflict that breaks out, Japan is going to play an important role as the host of those troops. And so I think, we need to take and try to manage tensions. We need to try and over time, hopefully try to work through them. So there is an incentive, but, I'm not, overly, or I don't have the perspective that we're going to solve this anytime soon, but we need to find a way to try to work through this. And, the Biden administration has made this an important issue for them. So I think that's another incentive.
On that note as well, of general interest, we were actually curious on our side too of the U.S.'s role with dealing with South Korea-Japan tensions. So we actually asked in our poll if most Americans would support a U.S. role in reducing tensions between South Korea and Japan. And I will share the results right here. And we had a much more split response, so that only 37% of Americans support a U.S. role in reducing tensions between South Korea and Japan. But we had almost an equally large number at 34% of people that weren't sure. I'm sure a lot of that is because a lot of Americans probably aren't too familiar with the current situation between South Korea and Japan. And you can see that there's some partisan difference, that Democrats are more in favor of a more proactive U.S. role, and Republicans the opposite way, that most of them do not support, or more do not support than do support.
Thank you both for those wonderful inputs. I think that summed up the question really nicely. If I might ask another question from the audience, this is from Robert Gay, and forgive me if I'm a little bit summarizing the question here, but there was a discussion and remarks regarding the migrant crisis in Central America during the conversation between President Moon Jae-in and Vice President Kamala Harris. What are your views on the two countries' views on the migrant crisis in Central America? And if I might slightly extend the issue, is it any indicator for the two countries' views on human rights as a whole?
Well, I'm not sure how reflective it is of the view of the two countries on the whole, but I do think, when we look, whether it be South and Central America or other parts of the world, there are a couple incentives that should be driving both countries' policies. One is, we know that climate change is going to change access to water. It's going to change vegetation patterns and other things. this is going to probably drive migration in the future. Two, economic opportunities often drive migration. And so, this has been the long story, whether it was first, with Mexico, now Central America, is, how do we create the economic opportunities, in these countries to where, people want to stay, they want to build lives, in their countries and not try, to migrate because they feel they have no other choice. But there's a third component of this, which obviously is governance. And, a lot of these countries have had governance issues, they've had crime issues. And so I think this is a long, difficult problem. And, there are probably ways the two countries, be it in Central America or be it other parts of the world, work to try and address this in specific areas. And, it would be beneficial, but ultimately this is something that probably requires broader cooperation. So on climate change, clearly we need to work globally in terms of looking to how do we take and provide aid and funding and technology that's going to be needed to countries that are going to experience significant changes in their environment. It's going to be, how do we take and restructure our supply chains partially in secure ways, but then also perhaps provide some opportunities to these countries. And then, the real challenge is how do you deal with this governance and crime issue? And I think that's going to be the difficult part going forward.
Yeah, I would note that's actually in the summit declaration and joint statement. There's two specific commitments. One is to increase cooperation between USAID and COECA, which is the Korean Development Agency. So they've agreed to work together more closely on promoting development. There's also a reference to establishing a US ROK democracy and governance consultation process, DGC, where the two sides are actually going to talk and cooperate on trying to promote democracy and governance.
Yeah, and I guess on the human rights side of things, it is, I don't think this was necessarily the decision to have South Korea provide more funding to Latin American countries. I think it was upwards of $220 million over the next few years. I think that was not necessarily born out of human rights, as the question brings up, but I think that it was a lot of stress on human rights and democracy, but separate human rights and democracy separately. And I think that there was a strong appreciation for the Biden administration for South Korea's involvement in trying to push back against the regime in Myanmar, and South Korea's response, which was a bit more forceful than it's been in recent years in relation to other areas where there's been crackdown on civil liberties and human rights, and in China, in Hong Kong. And I think with Myanmar, South Korea took a more vocal stance earlier on than it did in some of those other areas. So I think there was definitely an effort in the summit for Biden to sort of goad South Korea even more along those lines.
Kyle, you had mentioned earlier about areas, or actually maybe it was Troy, forgive me, sometime during the webinar, we had discussed potential areas for tech cooperation between Indo-Pacific nations, including Japan, potential areas for Australia, Japan, United States, South Korea to cooperate on tech. Digging a little deeper into that, is there an appropriate area for the US, Japan, and South Korea to collaborate trilaterally to mitigate any gaps in cooperation in addressing threats posed by Pyongyang?
So do you mean any specific like international fora?
I think thinking broadly, any areas where we should be working further to mitigate any gaps in potential security threats posed by North Korea?
Well, I think one thing that there needs to be more discussion on is, this happens over every administration, but North Korea is constantly refining and developing their technologies. So they have more advanced missile systems now. They're getting closer to having, SLBMs. So we need to be starting to ask, how do we address these growing challenges? But, beyond that, we tend to take and focus on the missile threats and the nuclear threat. And that's understandable. If North Korea uses a nuclear weapon, that would be, a horrific outcome. But every day, South Korea is attacked about 1.5 million times by North Korea via cyber attacks. We see North Korea consistently, put out malware ransomware, and other types of cyber attacks and viruses that are used to either hack into cryptocurrency exchanges to steal money, that are used to take, and as we saw with the WannaCry, to extort places, and that hit things like the British National Health Service. So, on a trilateral level, the United States, Japan, and South Korea are all sort of, cyber targets for North Korea. And I think we really need to start putting more effort and more collaboration to this. On a bilateral level, we saw this mentioned some in the fact sheet. Cyber is actually mentioned fairly early in the joint statement as well, but not really fleshed out in the joint statement. But I think, this is an important area because, there's the potential of an attack from North Korea via, ballistic missiles or nuclear weapons. But, every day, basically, we are facing a challenge from North Korea as they try to take in mind into our systems. The shutdown pipeline in the United States, the U.S. government believes that North Korea has the capability to do something like that as well. Not that they did this specific attack. So there are threats to our economies, threats to our infrastructure, and threats to our financial system. And all of these are areas that we should be working together more on in the cyber field.
Thank you, Troy.
I think Americans underappreciate the threat North Korea poses to Japan. North Korean missiles have overflown Japanese territory. Japan hosts the United Nations Command logistics operation for supporting the alliance in case of conflict in the peninsula. The North Koreans remember that U.S. bombers flew off of Japanese bases to bomb North Korea. So the North Koreans have Japan very much in mind. And defense, extended deterrence for the U.S. and South Korea must include Japan too. The three countries are very interlocked when it comes to North Korea threat.
Well, thank you, team, for your wonderful comments in this Q&A session as well. I wanted to maybe close with some final remarks from the team. Perhaps things that you felt as though should have been included in the summit that wasn't included in the summit, or if there's nothing that was excluded from the summit, something that you're looking forward to in future engagements between the two governments. Mark, would you like to lead us off?
Yeah, briefly, I'll mention one thing that puzzled me, and I'll make one general conclusion. For me, the puzzlement was in the statement about cooperating on civilian nuclear energy, which is in the joint statement. To me, it's a little bit inexplicable that South Korea would be working with the US on civilian nuclear power at the same time that the Moon Jae-in administration has been reducing or trying to eliminate nuclear power in South Korea. There's probably a good reason for that contradiction, but I don't quite understand it. My general observation is that I don't want to judge this summit yet. I think it's too soon. I think we're going to know in time how many of these initiatives for cooperation bear fruit. So it may be looking back on it, the summit will be important as being the launching pad for a whole new range of cooperation, in which case it'll look very successful, or nothing may come of it for one reason or another. In that case, it won't. So I wouldn't judge it yet. Let's give it 2 or 3 years, and then I'll tell you how good the summit was.
So I'll give 2 areas, one in North Korea area where I'd like to see more, and one broader economic cooperation. So on North Korea, I think we talk a lot about how we're going to denuclearize North Korea, but oftentimes the United States and South Korea don't talk much about what the future of North Korea looks like after that. President Trump would talk about building resorts or something in North Korea, but I do think we need to have deeper discussions, and I don't want to prejudge that because it wasn't in the statement that these discussions didn't take place. But I do think we need to have deeper discussions about what that future looks like, how you build, for example, a green energy infrastructure if we get a nuclear deal in North Korea. So that way, any economic development is built from a sustainable standard going forward, rather than built on, the fossil fuel industry, which, might be a natural course given the coal deposits in North Korea. And so beyond sort of deeper cooperation on what North Korea's economic future might look like, which clearly North Korea will need to have a say in as well if we get a deal, I think it's important that we start having deeper conversations on cooperation on artificial intelligence. This is a topic that, is perhaps maybe overplayed in the press, but is going to play a very large role in things like supply chain security through like smart plants, redirecting supply chains when certain factories go down. It plays an important role in monitoring data, sifting through data. It plays an important role in trying to take and research into things like vaccines. This actually played a role in the test kits, if I remember correctly, that South Korea developed on COVID-19. So this new technology, which, isn't going to necessarily, mean that we're going to have, autonomous thinking, machines, in 2 years or something, is playing a more important role. And I think it's important that we start talking on how we're going to take and collaborate on this, what types of standards we're going to have, and even, on things we think about autonomous vehicles, which, Tesla and other companies are building into. If there's an accident, who is responsible? Is it the driver? Is it the automaker? Is it the software provider? So there's legal issues, there are security issues, and so I would encourage deeper cooperation on artificial intelligence.
I had a point I wanted to raise, but I think that before I get to that, Troy brings up really good points about these forward-looking areas. And I'd just like to point out, this is a very stark difference from where we were under the previous administration, especially on trade. We were very much focused on bilateral trade deficit in goods. And when we revisited the Chorus FTA, it was very much focused on not EVs or autonomous vehicles. It was very much focused on traditional combustion engines, things in which that held a lot of sway in the 20th century, but may not be as important to moving forward in the 21st century. So I think it's really important that we've, excuse me for the pun, but we've changed gear, we've shifted gears here to look forward to new technologies, and particularly in autos and AI and things in those areas. But what I wanted to mention was also, I think it was really great that there was acknowledgement of opportunities for collaboration on social issues on both sides of the Pacific. And they mentioned that there was going to be a domestic violence and cyber exploitation working group, and that the United States is going to do better on anti-Asian hate. And I think where we can, those issues, the social issues, are hugely important in Korea, and I know they're really important here, and areas in which we can work together on to address those crucial areas that really aren't addressed necessarily in terms of foreign policy, but in effect impact both how we view one another, are really important. And I think that there's a lot of headway to make there, and it's good to see that both sides are acknowledging that.
Now, one thing that was briefly mentioned during the summit, which I think will have widespread implications, is the termination of the revised missile guidelines by South Korea. Previously, it restricted South Korea's missile range capabilities, but now, without having the guidelines there, that there's a much wider range of missiles that they can produce. It has implications for South Korea's own defense, but it would be interesting to see China's reaction, considering recent history with the economic sanctions over the deployment of THAAD missile batteries a few years ago, and to see how China reacts to this, how South Korea takes it in, and also just the evolving relationship, the security alliance between the U.S. and South Korea.
Well, thank you all for your comments and time today. I think we had a really compact and succinct discussion on a myriad of topics, and I think we all got a better understanding of the summit outcomes as a result. For the audience, we encourage you to visit our website and examine the survey results that were frequently mentioned throughout this session. You can visit us at keia.org, and you will find the survey in the slider on the home page. If you're watching us via YouTube, please do subscribe and tune in again on Thursday for a conversation with Harvard Medical School's Dr. Keith Park. We had mentioned that vaccinating North Korea is one of the key challenges to not only making sure that the global pandemic is stopped, but also a way to get North Korea further along the line of discussing denuclearization as well. So it'll be a key challenge for both global health and security in the region. And we'll be having a very meaningful conversation on that topic on Thursday. So do subscribe and tune in again. And you'll also find the RSVP for that event on our website as well. With that, I would like to thank the participants here today for their time and their comments. And to you, audience, thank you for attending, and we look forward to seeing you again on Thursday. Thank you very much. Have a great day.